We have some really interesting stuff to talk about today, so I think we may have solved a good chunk of the secret of the Mimic lore before the game is even out. There's so much info here that link Henry and Edwin that I decided to save the actual theory video and just go with this big bucket of info that we have here. There's a lot to chew on. It's gonna take a while to explain all this, so I apologize if the video is a little longer than usual. But I think I have a general idea of where Scott is trying to go with the story here. So what if, instead of the books paralleling the games, the books kind of parallel some of the other books? Specifically the Silver Eye trilogy. I want to start by bringing up the Silver Eyes trilogy. They are clearly their own timeline, but they also share remarkably similar details to Edwin and the Mimic story from the Pizzaplex books. Alright, so let's compare Henry from the Silver Eyes trilogy and Edwin from the Pizzaplex books, shall we? They both create robots that are much more than just machines. Henry loses his daughter and makes 4 different robots to represent the stages of life his daughter Charlie would have had. They're called Charlie bots, but so first he makes a little doll, then a child, a teenager, and a full-grown woman. The 4th one he didn't exactly finish, and this is where the similarities really begin. He creates a type of life in the robots that makes the robots special. Similarly, Edwin builds a robot that shows signs of also being something more than just a robot. It responds in human-like ways and shows emotion. The only difference in the two creators here is that Edwin's child dies after the robot is already built, while Henry's child dies before he creates his robot. But both creators have arguably made life, in a sense. Don't worry, it gets better than this somewhat questionable similarity. Also, if you're confused about why I think the Mimic is more than just a machine that's mimicking, I have another video explaining the details of that. One more small point before we dig into the much more glaringly obvious similarities of these two stories. I wasn't sure where to include this part, so I'm just including it right here. But both creators, in a sense, die from their own creations. Henry makes a robot to off himself, and Edwin's Mimic 1 program ultimately gets him killed too. Yes, I know he technically gets locked in by the, manager, but I wanted to mention it anyway because he technically, dies with his machine and, is talking to it as he dies, and his program is what got him there in the first place. But more importantly, more similarities. Both creators grieve immensely after losing their child, and both books make oddly similar notes about how long each of them grieve. For example, Henry's grief is told as he cried over that cheap store-bought ragdoll for 2 months. He cried into it, he bled into it, he poured his grief over it. Does this sound familiar? In the Mimic story, Edwin lost 2 weeks of his life entirely, and had no memory of anything since then. But soon he remembers a memory he blocked out, which is told as, now he could remember squeezing Tiger, crying so hard that his tears soaked Tiger's fur. So 2 weeks for Edwin's grief, 2 months for Henry's grief. Both share the number 2, and for some reason both books specify the length of time that these gentlemen were not functioning in reality. They were just completely lost in grief. I can't help but notice this. Also, both creators are holding a plush, like a ragdoll and a plush, and crying into it. Both stories making sure to note them crying over it and pouring themselves into it in a sense. But there's more. The Ella ragdoll is said to be all that Henry had left after his daughter was taken. Similarly, in the second part of Edwin's story when he's much older, it mentions that in Edwin's little rental he's living in, he had added nothing of his own when he'd moved in. Nothing but his clothes and toiletries, a handful of books, and a small item that sat, dingy and beleaguered, on top of the dresser. Edwin knew he shouldn't have kept it, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It was the only thing he had left of a time that he shouldn't have been allowed to forget. I'm very confident that this item is the tiger plush from the Mimic story. So all that Henry had left after his daughter was taken is the rag doll, and all Edwin had left was the tiger plush. Very bizarre similarity. The Silver Eye trilogy is a bit more complex with its creation story, as it's spread into 3 full books. But the important thing to point out is that the adult robot Henry created was created out of rage. He seethed as he soldered her skeleton together, pouring his anger into the forge where he shaped her very bones. And so this robot, when it's talking to one of the other Charlies in the books, describes herself as being made alive with Henry's fury. She says, he tried to fix the flaw he saw in me at first, But what was wrong, as Henry saw it, was the very thing that made me alive. Rage, Charlie said softly. Edwin, unfortunately, pulls a similar move by becoming furious at his own creation as well, battering and pulverizing the mimic, screaming and spittling as he wildly demolishes the mimic. The story makes sure to specify that Edwin could feel his murderous thoughts pouring through his muscles and transfusing through the metal into the mimic's systems. This is so similar to this Henry's story about how he's pouring his anger into her very bones. It's like the exact story, just different characters. Next, both Edwin's mimic and the Charlie bots that Henry makes are meant to represent their respective deceased child. So the bots that Henry makes are supposed to be Charlie, and the mimic that Edwin makes is essentially David. And you might want to call me out on it, but listen, the only difference about the mimic is that the mimic was made as a toy or mimic for his son, which essentially mirrors everything David did. The last line of the story that describes the mimic emphasizes this similarity that it has to David for us, stating that at some point during Edwin's assault, Mimic had toppled over and he now lay, arms bent, in one last tragic copy of Edwin's little boy. This strangely specific wording really stands out to me as a reassurance that the Mimic is not just a playmate that Edwin made for David, but to Edwin, it's an imitation of him. The book even uses the word copy, a copy of David. That has some bizarre implications, to be honest, and I don't really want to go into it here. So overall, do I think that Edwin is replacing Henry from the games? No, actually. It's possible that the story goes that route, but I think more likely is they're taking a mixture of this mimic story and blending it together with the Henry from the book's story. Since our game Henry seems to have established lore that already somewhat contradicts the book Henry, I find it more likely that Scott really just loved that original series of books, as it resonates highly with some of the kinds of things he used to make before FNAF, and that this is just a thrilling way to incorporate those elements into modern FNAF while still having enough twists and turns to separate it from the lore that we already know. The Silver Eyes trilogy has also been used in the FNAF movie. Some of the ideas are like pulled directly from it, and so I can't help but wonder if maybe the games are going a similar route. As far as the lore, this wouldn't change anything about our game Henry, and we still have the opportunity to learn more about him as well. There's a lot of flexibility with how the actual game events could occur in Secret of the Mimic. And I'm not trying to say that the Mimic is going to play out just like the Silver Eyes trilogy. I'm just saying there's some very interesting similarities, and I think that some of the themes and ideas may be pulled from that trilogy of books. So will everything play out just like that? No. Like, even just the way that the characters are created is different, but there's enough similarities that I don't think it's far-fetched for us to use the Silver Eyes as some sort of a reference point for Edwin and the Mimic and that whole story. It's not that the story is going to turn out just like that, obviously, but that this is something that we can read to try and get an idea of what the writer's intent is in the Secret of the Mimic game. But what do you think? Do you think I've lost it? Because that's fine too. I hope to see you all next time. Thanks for watching.